We're going to look at the topic of a time of crisis. The sense I have is that people are a little bit anxious in society. Do you get that feeling sometimes? Yesterday, I was in the gym, which I do occasionally, and I was on the treadmill, and I was running along on the treadmill at a certain speed, not too great, not too low. And there was a man next to me, and I didn't really look and see who it was. And halfway through the run, I realized that I recognized him, and he started talking to me while I was running. He had the advantage that he was just fast walking at about half the speed, which makes a very unequal conversation. I hadn't seen him for about 3 months, and he simply poured out his troubles. It was astonishing. I thought of all the things I wanted to say to him, but I couldn't say them, and he left before I'd finished, so there's a conversation to be had. The previous day, somebody had visited me in my office in town, sat on the comfy chair I've got on the side for visitors, asked them how they were, and they simply poured out all their troubles. Some of which I knew, some of which I didn't. I know this person moderately well, new acquaintance. Deep anxiety about life. This lady left with a little gift, which I conveniently had at hand. Earlier in the week, someone had been talking to me about the impact of news on their psychology. And said to me, I'm not sure I can cope with the amount of bad news that I'm receiving in many forms of media and news communication. Does that ring any bells with you? Now, these are 3 relatively insignificant anecdotes that happen to have happened to me in the last 5 days as I've been preparing this talk. But I propose to you this morning that they represent more than the individual stories. They represent a growing mood in our culture, which I describe, and some other people have described, but this is my description, as a new age of anxiety. I think we're entering into a very anxious time in our culture. Economics alone is enough to make us anxious, with this incredible gap between the rich and the poor and current issues, which I'll come back to in a minute. There's enough to worry us there. But we've also seen a remarkable development in the last few years of deep concern about mental well-being. Have you noticed that in society? Wherever you look, whatever kind of context you're in, secular or Christian, educational or business or any kind of context, mental well-being is an area of great concern. As I was preparing this talk, I happened to read in the newspaper, purely by chance, a report from the Netherlands, one of the most settled and secure Western European countries, a society not dissimilar to our own, in which a recent report indicated that 25% of adults considered themselves to be relationally lonely. This is in a rich Western culture with a strong social provision and a stable form of government. And the Netherlands Minister for Health stated tellingly, the feeling of belonging and mattering is a basic need of every human being. The feeling of belonging and mattering is a basic need of every human being, and yet that need is not being met sufficiently in our sophisticated secular Western societies. People are feeling vulnerable and anxious in ever larger numbers. It's a slow and growing process that's been happening for a long time, and it's accelerating, in my judgment, right now. Here's another interesting perspective. The government recently commissioned a report on race relations, known as the Sewell Report, after Dr. Tony Sewell, who was the black leader of that commission, which reported on a vast amount of data. I heard a report in London, some of the commissioners present answering questions. I was there personally because I'm interested in the area. And they were dealing with a tense issue of race relations in our country. But one of the recommendations of this report was to say, let's look beyond race, because we have discovered something in our enormous research, which is that across all ethnic communities, one of the most crucial factors in the well-being of people is not so much race, but family. And the government was so struck by this outcome that they appointed the Children's Commissioner, Rachel D'Souza, to another report on family relationships in the UK. And she's just given her first report, and I listened to a talk that she gave recently online summarizing the findings of the report. And here's this secular report saying family matters more than we ever thought it did. And all the research that she gathered together from all these different areas indicated they interviewed huge numbers of children, personally, in suitable conditions. They interviewed huge numbers, thousands and thousands. It was a very large sample. And parents and children and extended family members alike, the chorus was, family really matters. And she said, it's the safety net for us when we fall. That's a quotation from her statement that I heard her say just a few days ago. And yet, the traditional family is declining. And more people are feeling disconnected from their family. And both the race report, Dr. Sewell, and Rachel D'Souza's report say family matters incredibly in terms of the outcomes in life. Secure family relationships give a huge benefit to the likely positive outcomes in your adult life in every area of your life. And yet there's anxiety around the family. There's a vulnerability there in our society that's growing. And I'm saying it's still growing, in my estimation. And another issue that's come to the surface recently in our culture is addictions. Whether they're substance-related addictions or behavioral patterns of addictions, extreme physical practices, pornography, shopping online in an addictive fashion, any number of different things. And addiction, in one sense, is seeking to find a comfort zone away from our problems and our anxieties. Seeking to find a comfort zone away from our problems and our anxieties. We're wrestling with addictions on an unprecedented scale. We're also wrestling with information on an unprecedented scale. Never in human history has any generation been bombarded with so much easily accessible information. When I was at school in 1976, I was told at an assembly in our school that the school had purchased, guess what? A computer. My goodness me, it was an astonishing thing. One of the study rooms, a room about the size of this area here on the stage in the middle, which had desks, I used to work in it, had room for about six form students to work in, was banned. We weren't allowed to go in there anymore. Why? Because they put a computer in there and it took up the whole room. Literally, the whole room. This is before the internet. I mean, these were basic days, wires and boxes and monitors, and I just peeped in the door and I thought, wow, what's happening? And today, you and I hold in our pockets a computer thousands of times more powerful than what I saw in the 70s, with incredible capacities, a capacity for both good and trouble. And one of the challenges is the sheer amount of information. I honestly don't know how doctors cope when their expert patients come through the door having read 47 articles about that condition before they've even spoken to the doctor. And yet we're wrestling. I'll tell you what too much information does. It overloads the brain and it creates anxiety. We have to learn how to manage that information. And many people haven't learned how to manage it. It's a spectacular gain in many ways, but a high risk in others. And I believe that the presence of a spectacular amount of information of easily accessible to us creates anxiety at a subliminal level in many people's lives. And all these things, can you see what all these things are doing? They're fueling a fire in what I call the age of anxiety. And we haven't yet spoken about social media. I've lost count of the number of conversations I've had with Christians who are troubled by social media. An expert in America found these 4 challenges from social media. I haven't got time to go into them in detail, but I'm just going to give them to you as headlines. That it produces time wasting on a monumental scale. Have you ever come to the end of an evening and thought to myself, I've been on Facebook all evening, why did I bother? Come on, you must have done that. Or something equivalent. It can create inauthentic and irresponsible communications. I met a guy not so long ago, a couple of years ago, who headed up a charity in Manchester. And he put something on Facebook about a particular social issue that was controversial at the time, and some people absolutely slammed him for it on social media. Random people out there in the ether. And the trustees of the charity got so worried about it that they sacked him on the basis of a few tweets and Facebook posts. He took legal advice, fought back, got reinstated, and insisted that all the charity trustees resign. They'd simply caved in to a number of anonymous people on social media. Inauthentic communication. I sat with him and he told me the story. We sat next to each other at a conference. He told me the whole story. He's not a Christian. Social media can undermine trust in institutions and can exacerbate conflicts very easily. We live in an anxious age. Recent interviews on television during the Tory party conference, I'm not going to comment on that. I'm just going to talk about people's social perceptions. Was this, talking about how they felt about society. Parents, older people, we're worried about the next generation. What's it going to be like for our children and our grandchildren? There's a sense of anxiety in the air. Would you agree with me that this somehow characterizes the mood that many people are in? Not everybody are there, but more and more people are getting sucked into some of these things. Would you agree with me? And then, on the 24th of February, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. And now we have a whole new set of issues. A massive increase in the economic crisis around energy and food costs, and the so-called cost of living crisis with mortgages and housing and all sorts of other issues now accelerating at a fantastic speed, causing another whole wave of uncertainty and, in some cases, despair for people in our country, especially those who are economically vulnerable. And we also have the prospect of international war rising over the horizon. And only in the last few days, President Biden says this is the most dangerous moment in the world since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which is a very long time ago. That's a lifetime ago and more for most of us here, both in China, with Taiwan, and particularly with Russia in the European situation. So we live in uncertain times. But it's interesting to me that in the midst of all this, we had the Queen's funeral. And we had an astonishing outpouring of national grief and loyalty and respect for the Queen. I myself participated in it. I was working in London just before the funeral, and I went to Buckingham Palace in some spare time to pay my respects and looked around Green Park and all the flowers that were there. It was a very moving experience. I identify with that process. But I want to suggest to you something that hasn't been said in the media. What was the appeal of the Queen so deeply to our nation? Many things that have been said, and they've been said very eloquently by others. But I want to suggest another narrative, which I think is equally important. She was the antidote to anxiety. She represented calm in the storm, faith where there's doubt, family values where they're cracking, even within her own family, being connected with the past when we're losing touch with the past, being connected with God when we're losing touch with God. She represented so many things subliminally to people that was one of the things that caused this massive outpouring of connection and grief at that particular time. It's only a part of the story, but I believe it's a part of the story that it's worth us considering. So in the midst of all this, what is the word of the Lord? A few weeks ago, during our prophetic section in the meeting, which is really important, and as elders, we value the prophetic contributions very much. We listen. Some are for the day, some are in passing, some are profounder and more significant and more lasting. And I just listened with great interest when somebody came up and said, I believe that God wants to speak to us about Elijah when he was fed by ravens. So I'm now going to turn in a slightly different way to this text, and we're going to just ponder this text for a few moments in this talk. This is the biblical framework for this talk today. The story of Elijah appears in 1 Kings chapter 17. Many of you might be familiar with the story, some of you perhaps not. And it starts with the following words. They're going to come up on the screen. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. Now this man Elijah, we don't know anything about his background except he lived in a remote and insignificant town called Tishbe. And he came to the king, who was extremely hostile to God, had turned away from God in a dramatic way. And this insignificant man prophesied drought. Not just drought like we experience drought, like a few weeks or months. One summer's rather dry, like we've had this particular year. But drought over a few years, which to the Israelites was a really threatening reality. So this was a brave man. He'd heard God, and God said something unpopular and difficult for the people. Verse 2. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Leave here, that's the king's palace in the center of the country of Israel. Turn eastward and hide in the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan. You'll drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine east of Jordan, and he stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. So this man went into a very remote location. The country, meanwhile, was sinking into an economic crisis. Sustained drought destroys everything, bit by bit, in a most brutal and terrible way. Animals begin to die, crops fail, food supplies are diminished, tension arises between people, and this was a situation that Israel was getting itself into. But Elijah went to this remote location. He was hiding from the king in this valley in the east. And we have a picture of the location, which is just going to come up now. This is the location. Think Raybrook. This is the size of the river. And during this time, many months passed. Elijah experienced enough water, and he also experienced an extraordinary miracle, ravens coming and feeding him. The morning and the evening, they brought bread and meat. So he experienced a continual miracle every single day. Now, it required faith for Elijah to live this way, because he was remote, he was isolated, he was hiding from the authorities of the king who wanted to kill him, we discover later on. And he depends on these birds. So every time he goes to sleep, he doesn't know whether they're going to arrive in the morning with bread that they've scavenged from somewhere, with meat that they've scavenged from somewhere, probably from somebody's house, and just bringing him pieces of meat and bread. It was just like an ongoing miracle that was happening in his life during this time of crisis and during this time of anxiety. Now, in that particular story, in that particular paradigm, lies something for us according to the prophecy that was given to us and according to this text. Because in the New Testament, James refers to Elijah, and he said, by the way, Elijah was just an ordinary man like you or me. Just a mere human. James chapter 5. And yet, there in the ravine, he experienced the miraculous provision of God. Now, in this crisis that we're experiencing in our land, my prediction is it's going to get worse, and it's not because I want to be a prophet of doom. I'm just reading the signs in a fairly straightforward way. The very identity of the church and its function is going to be tested. And we're going to be called upon to give over our anxieties to God in a fresh way. And according to the prophecy that Graham gave earlier on, which I found very, very interesting, going through an open door without fear into the provision and the promise of God in a fresh way, just like Elijah did. Elijah had to wholly trust God. He'd given an incredibly unpopular word. And how was he going to survive? He didn't have his own small holding and farm as far as we know. He just went out into the wilderness and he just waited for God's miraculous provision. And the thrust of this talk today is that in order for us to prepare for a future where there's going to be more instability, more people in need, more people crumbling in their lives, more people looking for answers, more people knocking on the door of the church, more evangelistic opportunities, this place needs to be a haven of God's peace and not an amalgamation of anxieties. And the only way that's going to happen is if you and we have plenty of reason to be anxious and worried, and some of us will think this morning, I've got a huge number of issues on my plate. Well, I really identify with that. But I believe what the Holy Spirit is asking us to do is to trust him more decisively by literally handing over the things that worry us to him in a deeper way than we've consciously done. And at the end of this talk, there'll be an opportunity for us to do that. For some of us who think, the thing that's making me unproductive as a Christian is that I'm worrying about the future, about this situation, that situation. My emotional energy is going on worry rather than on advancing the kingdom. Now, those issues are real. But God will give us resources as we trust him and as we come to him. And I believe we're going to enter into a whole new way of understanding that as our nation gets more and more caught up in anxiety and the economic distresses that go along with it. In conclusion, let me illustrate this. I have here some seed. Jesus told a story about seed and a farmer. You know the story well, and there's one thing in the story I'm going to illustrate, not the whole story. This is the word of God, the seed, the living word that goes out, and some of it goes onto the path. And it never germinates on the path because the birds come and eat the seed up. Some of it goes on rocky ground round the edges of the field, perhaps. And it takes root, but it's such a shallow root that it just withers away over time. Some of it goes on really productive soil, beautiful soil already. It produces 30, 60, or even 100 times its own capacity when it comes to harvest. But it's the last one I want to focus on. This is the one for us today. Some of the seed goes into soil which has got weeds and thorns growing up alongside it. And it's struggling. It's still alive, it's real, it's germinated, but it's not producing the outcomes that it should. What happened to that seed? Jesus describes 3 things that caused a problem here. Number 1, the worries of this life. Number 2, the deceitfulness of wealth. And number 3, the desire for other things. Let me just focus on one of them. The first one, the worries. A Christian whose seed has germinated, it's real faith, it's growing. There it is on the screen. But it's not very fruitful because there's so much junk around. Thorns and weeds. A state of paralysis has come over that person because they're anxious. They're struggling to trust and to let go. And today, we're going to make a breakthrough in that area. Now, I could so easily be that person because every week I have plenty of things to worry about, I can tell you, on so many different levels. I could tell you many, many things. So I struggle with this just as much as you do. But I've learned that there's a transaction we can do with God. When we literally say, this is the issue, Lord, but I'm giving it to you. I'm not going to try and control it anymore because I can't. But I'm going to cooperate with you. Whatever you do will be the breakthrough, but I can't do it myself. And I want to be free of the controlling influence of these issues, which cause me to be paralyzed with anxiety. Elijah was fed by ravens. God can do incredible financial miracles, relational miracles, family miracles, health miracles, practical miracles in your life. But sometimes we have to just let go of the issue in order to enable him to work. Let's